I suppose I ought to start by saying welcome to Manchester. This is kind of my patch, and the home of democracy in Manchester, the Town Hall, a building of which I'm enormously proud, although it does have some challenges. I'm going to talk for 5 minutes, maybe a bit less, about devolution in Manchester and some of the challenges that poses about democracy and engagement. But this morning I've had a very salutary lesson in the interchangeability of politicians, so I thought I might start with that. There are 2 deputy leaders in Manchester. The other one is Bernard Priest. We share an office just around the corner. And Bernard had a lot of stuff to bring in with him this morning, so he came in his car and said to the guy on the barrier, "Can I just take my car in the courtyard while I unload?" And the guy said, "I'm sorry, not this morning, you'll have to do it from the street because we've got a very important MP in the building." So Bernard said, "Who is it?" And he said, "I think it's that Tony Blair." And Bernard thought, Tony Blair in the town hall, maybe he's at FutureEverything, who knows, but didn't see him on the list. And he said, "Tony Blair?" He said, no, not him. It's David Cameron, that's who it is. And Bernard thought, I'd probably have known if David Cameron was coming, but by process of elimination, they got to who it actually was. And it's George Osborne, who is actually in the town hall today signing an agreement about devolution. But that is just a lesson about how similar politicians are in people's minds. It's a really abject lesson for me, although hopefully nobody's going to confuse me with George Osborne, but then who knows. So what George was actually here for was to sign the health devolution agreement that some of you might have seen the press coverage of over the past few days about health spending in Manchester and how we can spend money together to get better results for people. And Manchester's really at the forefront of devolution, a subject very close to my heart, very close to Pat's heart as well, as I know. How can we bring decision-making and budgets and money closer to local communities is at the heart of what we want to do. And we hope that we're leading the way about how some of that can be done. And we have quite an ambitious programme. Public spending in Manchester and Greater Manchester is about £22 billion. Most of that is spent on a national basis. And our aim is to have control locally of the whole of that £22 billion worth of spending on health, on our economy, on skills, on everything that you can think of, because we think we know our area best, we know how best to spend the money. If they won't let us spend it directly, we should at least have a much greater influence on how that is going to be spent. You know, we see ourselves as the driving force between what's become known as the Northern Powerhouse. And it's a very exciting place to be at the moment. And the prize of that, you know, having control over our destiny, not determined by Whitehall, but determined in Manchester itself, is a really big opportunity. There's an American academic called Bruce Katz who's written a lot about the Metropolitan Revolution and about the idea of city mayors. And there's a quote in one of his books which is really, I think, at the heart of what I think is the difference between local and national politicians. He said, local politicians are more popular and take better decisions because they have to live with the result of those decisions in a way that national politicians don't. And that really, for me, is at the heart of why I want to do what I do about devolution. But there are some challenges about that. How do we communicate that we believe that decisions taken locally are best for people and that they should have a say in those decisions? How do we make them feel engaged and understand what we're doing? These are decisions that affect people's day-to-day lives, and we should be laying the foundation as part of devolution, greater citizen involvement in those decisions, and a better way of communicating to people our vision and how they feel connected and can influence that. So we need to deal with things like encouraging people to vote. At the same time as we're doing this, wanting to encourage people to vote, the turnout in the Scottish referendum was absolutely amazing. That's because people felt that their vote was going to make a difference. Whichever way they were voting, they thought it actually counted. We've got a new system in the UK at the moment for voter registration, which is entirely online. That's resulted in huge numbers of people dropping off the electoral register and about to lose their vote, particularly young people and particularly students. The number of students on the register in Manchester alone has gone down by, we think, about 15,000. We've got 15,000 less students registered to vote in an election in May, which is one of the most important elections that we're going to face, and one of the least predictable elections I've ever known than we had for the last general election. That's an enormous democratic deficit. If people believed that their vote would make a difference, I think they would register, and they're not. So that's an enormous problem for us. And as more and more decisions are taken locally, we need to do something about that engagement, make people feel empowered. So we need to make the most of our powers and make people see what difference it makes to us. It's a particular problem for us in Manchester. It's a problem that I'm quite pleased we've got in a way. There are 96 councillors in Manchester, 95 of them are Labour councillors. That puts an enormous responsibility on us. I like winning elections. I'm a Labour Party politician. That's kind of what I do. But it puts a big responsibility on us to communicate. We keep getting called in the press a one-party state. Now, yeah, probably there is one dominant party in Manchester. We don't have any political opposition within the council. So we have to be as open as we possibly can be. We have to make as much information about the decisions that we're taking to people available as possible, and they have to be able to see how we take those decisions. So we've done traditional things, really, made all our papers available online. We had a budget consultation which got a much better response than we've had before, but the distillation of that was the budget papers. That's 1,000 pages. That isn't really very engaging for people to have their say on, so we need to be better at that. We live stream all our meetings, all our scrutiny committees where we investigate what we're doing, the executive where we take the decisions, and our full council meetings. We've even live streamed a part of one of our private political meetings that we felt comfortable with people seeing the process about. That, feeling comfortable or not, is a big issue. But really, what we want to do is come up with a system that involves our citizens in that democratic process, involves us with them, that not only are we listening to what people say, that they genuinely believe that we are listening to them, needs to be at the heart of everything that we're doing. So I look forward to the questions. Thank you.
All right, I would say one burning question, which will then hopefully incite conversation between the four of you. But straight away for Gabriella, a fantastic presentation and really echoed a lot of my experience actually through the last 18 months. But there was three things coming to mind in my head. One was the way that city squares have become theatres for politics and protest, and sometimes even national renewal. And then I was thinking about Brazil, thinking about the protests leading up to the World Cup and the way that happened, on the streets of big cities in Brazil. And I'm thinking about, in Glasgow, the battles to take a place like George Square, which has been like a historic assembly point for, 100 years, 150 years, and defend it against the mollifiers and the developers, and just leave it as a public space. So I wanted to ask you whether you felt there was a problem about getting too close to the city fathers, in the sense that there's a sort of a way that citizens of the city have an energy and a radicalism that sometimes just has to come up rather than be translated, or so it has to sort of find its own forms. And so in terms of just particularly in terms of South America, do you feel as if you're alive to that problem? Not that you're commodifying dissent or bureaucratizing the dissent, but that you could be getting too close to the government and to the city fathers, and not allow for things to kind of come through that were critical or radical or genuinely oppositional. What do you think of that point?
Well, protests right now in Mexico in general are a big thing. We've had several very problematic things happening on a federal level. Things that don't necessarily happen in Mexico City always have a social repercussion nonetheless, because we are, I believe, kind of like the voice of the rest of Mexico. This is the bigger protests of things happening in other states actually happen in Mexico City. First of all, because Mexico City houses 34% of the population in general. So that in and of itself makes it into definitely like this echo of whatever happens in other places. I have the feeling that it actually is very much interestingly problematic space full of potential as well. Because first of all, many times we're in search of these social thermometers of feeling of just like trying to tap into these social energies. And these are things that already exist. Many times we do not have to go for the newer technology or invent like this wild thinking form or other, but actually be able to better tap into what already exists socially.
Favelas and so things that happen that come up from...
Absolutely, absolutely. So I believe that I have the feeling that there's a lot to be done in the exploration, as I mentioned, of what happens when the social energy can be married to political will. Many times you actually need that pushback, as well as people really being on the outside and pressuring government to do what it needs to do. But at other times, I actually think that this joining up of a social conversation or citywide conversation is actually incredibly powerful. So I must confess that I had a lot of stereotypes about government. And stepping into the other side actually makes me think that government is one of the best city-making machines out there. Many of the very forward and progressive policies that Mexico City now has did not have the social pressure, and the government stepped in and then actually created space for society to fill in. And then now that if any mayor tried to take that back, they'd be in trouble. And this had to do with opening up of public space, like everything from, as strange as it sounds, having 300,000 people listening to Justin Bieber in our public square. But just like allowing for that type of amounts of people to come into public space. Abortion rights, euthanasia, all of these things actually started as public policy, and then society followed.
Well, there's a corroboration of that from the projects that are coming through Goteo are extremely diverse civically. I mean, it's not just people who are interested in social technology. There's a lot of, that one about raising funds for a legal case against the bankers. So it's a question of actually creating subtle enough systems that pick up the signals, but at what point, where does it sit in the ecosystem? If it's a city government and it's a good city government, fine. But you're an entrepreneur, I guess. So you're coming from a kind of you have a rent that you extract from this to justify your business model. But nevertheless, you're enabling the same kind of diversity that you want to enable, but from a quite different place.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting moment in terms of there's no clear barriers with what's an entrepreneur or what could be the consequence of trying to, for example, get an impact by something you have produced through crowdfunding. There's examples of people trying to have an impact, producing, for example, printing something or envelopes in a place where they are, incorporating people that are in a difficult social situations, but this thing has to be produced there. Otherwise, they're losing meaning. They cannot go the same through crowdfunding, and it's difficult to sometimes identify what's a nice, coherent strategy, but connected to values that people will perceive as potential backers of a crowdfunding campaign. That if this project is the usual book or the usual product that it's produced, it's somewhere else. It's reverse capitalism. It's in a maquila. It's somewhere that this is very, very different to be an entrepreneur in your local context and trying to help the people you are close to. And these examples are also very interesting.
So your platform helps that to kind of at that level of
we're looking for those
protest enterprise to happen almost.
We're looking for those examples. We're seeing how they are evolving as well and take very interesting shapes. Because
I'll come to you in a minute, Jarmo, with a slightly separate question, but just to follow this theme a wee bit. As a councillor watching what passes through these platforms, we're hearing a great big public. This is what the public can do. It can create these spaces where discussions like this can happen. It did it 100 years ago. What do you do now when you look at this activity and think, well, here are the signals coming up from the citizenry? Do you look at your own practice and think, we've really got to sharpen up here, or we've got to?
I think you do. I mean, Manchester's got a really radical history of
indeed
protest.
As radical
Indeed,
as
it
it
has,
gets.
as radical as it gets. It's the home of a lot of protest. It's the home of the suffragette movement, all that kind of thing. And I actually think part of my job as a politician is to feel uncomfortable about things if people feel that I should be. So it's about how do people have those opportunities to make me question what we're doing, make us question what we're doing rather than me as an individual, make me feel uncomfortable. You know, how do we do that? How do we enable people to get their voices heard? How do we enable them to do what they think is important, not what we think is important? How do we go down to small communities and make them feel engaged with this big monolithic stuff that goes on in here? Is quite hard.
But a really practical question on this.
Yeah.
For example, if you're in control of more and more of your fiscal environment, is there any way that you could decide that a proportion of people's taxes are called citizen tokens and get used in platforms like yours and yours to make decisions about funding entities? Now, is that the city government incorporating, sucking in levels of civic innovation? Or is it that classic 19th century moment where you respond to the workers' libraries or you respond to the private railways and you think, right, there's a municipal dimension to this? I mean, I think it's a properly ambiguous question, whether you do stuff or whether you let it alone.
I think you have to do a mix of both. I think you have to do stuff, but you have to... We've just gone through our budget, as I said. We've had to take huge amounts of money because of the cuts that we've had from the government. One of the things we've protected is a very small community budget, which is around £25,000 per ward, per area in Manchester, that's determined locally what that's spent on. And it's allowing people to have £500 that sets up a community group, or £1,000 that enables them to do something locally that helps them engage young people, is much more powerful than some of the decisions we take in here about hundreds of thousands of pounds. So you have to have that element as part of it.
I think there's a gap in between. But
There
anyway,
is, you're right.
Do you want to respond to any of this? Because I've got a specific question that I wanted to ask you about your particular thing, your particular presentation.
Maybe I could.
Yeah, you want to hear the specific, or you want to?
I actually, to be frank, I didn't like your question about the.
I didn't ask you to like my question.
Not my question, but I think it's not sort of a valid question to think of civic innovation labs sort of a selling out kind of. I get a bit of that impression when you ask whether they should be collaborating with the government. If you want to have an impact, you need to deal with the ones who can make the impact, and government has the impact in government issues. So, I mean, it's, because I've been in the media culture field earlier, and that field is very self-sufficient, and it tends to be really happy about dealing with themselves. That has no impact. I mean, it creates lots of criticism, lots of good papers even, but no impact, because for them it's enough that their peers are happy for what they say. But if you're about to have a real impact in the society, you need to go in the society. And then you deal with both the people and the power which has which implements things in society. So I think it's absolutely necessary to deal with the government if you want to be anything else than just nagging columnist.
No, but I mean, I have to say, one of the reasons why I'm asking this question is because I was just at a conference in Dubai called the Government Services Conference. And they're equally obsessed with apps and labs and platforms. But plebiscitary democracy is not necessarily a part of that picture.
Yeah, that is true.
But I'm just trying to there's a perspective on governance that and city governance that it's a really interesting question.
Yeah.
But it doesn't necessarily fall within the coordinates of Fukuyama's
I could actually
ultimate liberal Western market.
Short sentence on that. I think one of the risks we do have in this field is that we might misunderstand or misread tools as an ideology.
Yes, indeed.
And tools are not an ideology. Tools are a way with which you can do many things. You can use apps and labs and hacks for different ideologies. And by themselves, they don't form any ideology. And they don't solve any issues unless they are connected in some target which is beyond the tools. In which case, I think you are dealing with the idea that, yes, the people must be empowered to be able to change the society from the inside. That is sort of the ideology, but the hackathon itself it can be, you can have great hackathons for dictators.
The question
Probably would be cool.
There was a point you made in your presentation which I wanted to pick you up, which, and it's based on my personal experience, going around cities. Now, what's the app that I reach for when I land in a city? It's Google Apps.
Yeah.
And whatever they've done to kind of deal with flows of data coming in, I can now navigate a city by virtue of looking up my style guide and then turning on my location, and I'm there. But it's quite interesting that the icon for public transport on Google Apps is a bus. It's not a train, it's not a tram. Because from the perspective of Palo Alto, Cupertino, it's only private buses that actually work as kind of public infrastructures. So, but that's a question about the universality of these apps. I mean, you're getting stuff coming in from China, from Japan and various other places. So you mentioned it, I think it's a really good point, that cities can be thinking that they have a certain amount of agency in this, but they're also in the networked world, and things are coming to them like steam trains. And so it's how do you have the wisdom to think that a big system comes in and actually just step changes the way that a citizen operates.
It is, that's one of the facts because of the nature of the internet. Anyone can do anything on the internet, anyone can launch an app, but actually it also creates monopolies faster than anything ever. I mean, we have never seen as quick monopolies as the internet has created, so it's the other side of the of the coin. And yes, Google is the biggest urban innovator at the moment. I think, cities, of course, must be aware of that.
Sure.
And yes, well, we can talk about democracy and US platforms, but maybe we shouldn't go into that.
No, sure.
Because we should be pretty careful about taking democracy in those realms.
Well, so that the other element of this discussion, the reason why I'm here is because, I'm slightly going against myself because as someone who's been active in the Scottish referendum, I'm particularly interested in legitimate governance, But it's that question of tools. That's a really good point. Tools are not ideologies. And to what extent, just to come back to yourself, how do you feel as if you're in a moment? I mean, what's the ideology of a public library? When workers got together to subscribe to create a public library, to put information into the communities, it wasn't so much an ideology, it was almost like a sort of civilizing impulse, So is there a sort of sense in which you've got to try and think about it's almost like a kind of classicism, that you're actually going back to the agora, the moment of the agora, and updating that for the present? It's literally, Ivan Illich called them tools for conviviality, but you're creating tools you're crafting tools that have to last and have a lot of generalized effects. So it's as much talking to you as a craft person. Are you aware that you're creating these tools that are elegant, beautiful, functional, multifunctional, and that have to last and work for a whole variety of different social groups, rather than just solve a particular problem?
It's a very interesting question. One of the things that we really reflected upon a year and a half ago when we were born was a little bit what is our way of being in the world, and one of the reasons why instead of being a laboratory for government, we decided to be laboratory for the city in its specific translation is because government is very much about the city, and I think this question of what a city is for has been changing. And I also think that it changes from context to context. So in Mexico City, where, as I mentioned, 50% of your population is working in the informal economy, or 50% of your population is under age 26, I actually do think that these types of spaces, even though, for example, many of my counterparts try to stay away from politics as much as possible, one of the things that we've seen is that this thing of the city as the polis and as the agra actually has embedded in it a need to actually also engage with the type of city that you want to create, and also understanding these, again, like government as a city-making machine, but not necessarily the ideology of government, but actually what you want your city to stand for. So even though I absolutely agree that the tools per se are completely neutral, one of the things that we've also seen is that they're also embedded in an idea of a city as well, and an idea of a society once you implement them. So if you actually have something that catapults certain type of social, a code, if you will, into the social scape, that actually can have very different repercussions on just like I do think that one has to be clear from where one is starting off. And I think in terms of a megalopolis, with these characteristics, thinking about the commons and the creation of public value and all of these things is actually something that we're incredibly interested in.
No, I mean, and I just want to ask, the word city centre, I know this is a ridiculous thing to say in a context of civic innovation and the city, but there's a word city centricity is coming to my head here, just to the extent, here are these pulsing, networked megalopolises, where fantastic institutions are creating plans and sending out social experiments, and the presumption is that the tide of history is sweeping people towards cities. Do we simply presume that that's good? That people human beings in an urban fabric is necessarily the best way for human beings to be in the urban fabric? I mean, what's Manchester's relationship to the green fields or the rural communities around about it? Does it have a responsibility to those areas? Or is it, this is where the action is, so come in here, use your tools, be part of this fantastic municipality, because that's the way that history is going. But there's a lot of discussion about how some of these technologies could be empowering localities that are not necessarily urban localities. And I'm just challenging you to sort of think, are you being city egoists, or civic egoists, just to some degree?
I think there is a danger of that. And I think part of it is allowing people to create their own models. I mean, I talked a lot about city regions, about devolution to Greater Manchester and Manchester. And that's what I'm interested in because it's my city. The first time in the census that there were more people living in what we'd now call urban areas than rural was 1851. So it's actually a process that's been going on for quite a long time. The growth of megacities, I think, is really interesting and a new development. But I think there's a duty on us really to produce something that does work mainly for my city, because that's what I do, but is a model that can be used in other places, that people can adapt and create their own models based on what we do, to be able to empower themselves, really. So the model of city government, I think, is really interesting. Health is what we've been doing this week. But one of the things that we've been trying to say is, yeah, we want to be able to do that for Manchester, but we actually think everywhere else should have the ability to do this for themselves. So part of it is about being prepared to just let things happen and people create their own models, even if we don't think they're right. You just have to experiment and let people's creativity create solutions that are best for them and their business, their city, their community, their area.
I mean, I just remember, I want to come back, but I remember in this Dubai conference there was an MIT presentation of talking about transforming tower blocks into city gardens and using sort of hydroponic technologies to massively increase, the productivity of food making. And it looked incredibly ingenious. But, when I think as a Scot, and I have an imaginary of my country in my head, I think green fields and vast areas that were cleared and maybe need to be repopulated, but necessarily in with this kind of intense sort of networked civicness. I mean, do you have that sense of slightly narcissistic take on being the city as the agent of the future?
What we have seen and connects also to the idea of technologies, not being or tools not being an ideology, but they are very, very good for ideologies. Or what happens with transparency? Transparency. For example, I will come to your question. But yes. I was thinking when you mentioned that there's, at least in Spain, an increasing importance in the debate about transparency and getting to know the details of where the money is going, who's responsible, where are the relationship between politicians and big companies, and this is a social demand. And this has been channeling, and we have experiences, just one part of the story, which is, okay, for specific tools that can be used and can be replicated because they are open source, we will need some resources. People then, made an effort, to create those things, which I think they have a certain degree of ideology behind. And then coming back to the issue of urban settlements and how, our societies are configured, we are observing, when you take a look at the data in our platform, but probably it's the same in other crowdfunding platforms, you see all the drops coming from centers like a fountain, and these are mainly urban. But then when they reach a certain level of visibility, drops come from everywhere. So you see this kind of, interest from other local areas. And for us, the question is how to validate those models. Now, for example, we are about to start with the Zaragoza City Council, one kind of match funding program for a project related to the smart city. And this will be another way of observing if there's a real interest from people in those projects. That could be regardening the ceilings of some buildings, or it can be more technological approaches. But then money will be also an indicator of the interest between the people and the big or small plans from the city council to bring some new things and validate them. And I think it's an interesting thing always when money's in the middle, because it generates discussion.
I just think the city is a kind of theatre for the turbulence of modernity. That sounds extremely pompous, but it is. But there are other sort of turbulences. I mean, in terms of Mexico City, you're looking at a city that is, you should say, is what percentage of the national population?
30.
Yeah. Is there any sense of the city in its context of the land, or the context of people in different class structures in different areas, and people coming into that environment? Are they attracted by the idea of being, apps, labs, hacks, having access to a kind of an exciting municipal structure? There's a sort of enculturation into the city, which is sort of presumed as necessarily always as a good thing, but it could just be baffling, alienating, frazzling.
In terms of Mexico City, there's several interesting things there. First of all, I think this move into cities and cities as strange attractors is inevitable. I don't think we have a say.
Force of history. Okay. Yeah.
Have a say in this. So, and also one of the things that I find very important is, as people have said before, let's say, because why the C40 pops up when the protocol Kyoto is not passed, and suddenly the biggest cities in the world decide to join together and sign everything that their federal counterparts were not able to sign. I think every ton of CO2 that you save a city actually has a repercussion not only for that city, but for the world, because of the size of the cities that we're speaking about. So just like the general impact that these mega cities especially have on the rest of us is actually too important for them not to be like these spaces where we need to be city-centric in many ways, to be world-centric.
Even in terms of the carbon bottom line, you're saying, yes.
And then another interesting thing is, in terms of Mexico City, that really defies so many. Every stereotype of Mexico City is true, and also the opposite is true. Mexico City is composed of 60% green spaces. 60% of the migratory birds fly into one of our protected zones. We have a park that is 2 times as large as Central Park, embedded inside of Mexico City, and there is a rural area that is probably the size of Manchester. We have been actually working with them, with Milpalta, which is the biggest plantation of nopal, in thinking about open innovation in spaces that are not digitally connected, and how you actually engage people on face-to-face and create, and think of social structures as these networks as well, where one can inject information. But then other things become those nodes, the libraries, the cultural centers, certain cultural leaders. So how do you actually think about that at the same time as you think about the possibilities of technologies that are more urban-based?
Jarmo, you want to come in?
Just to... Well, you stole my speech. Regarding nobody decided that we will become totally urbanized. It's most of the growth of urbanization rate is mostly unplanned in the world. It just happens. And I'm not sure if all the governments are that happy about it, even in the developing countries, because it's in many places sort of out of control. I think why it matters a lot to support open governance in these new cities is the fact that, we are still, if we think of the open governance as the phenomenon which started with the Age of Enlightenment, a few hundred years back, that was a radical thing. People were killed because, in Denmark, for example, because of this horrendous idea that the general public should be educated. It was such a revolutionary, stupid idea that people were actually executed for it. And we are still going through the process. We are nowhere done with Age of Enlightenment in the world.
Yes, sure.
Nowhere close. And cities can take different directions, and some of them can be pretty horrifying. And for that, I think the open governance and some tool-like things like open data and transparency, etc., can nudge things towards more democratic and sort of a more predictable urban communities, because what we probably will see is different kinds of surprises and black swans in forms of new ideologies, religions, etc., coming from the big cities.
Yes,
especially, when the when things become unstable is when the middle class grows.
Absolutely.
And when that's combined with sort of problems with economy, because middle class always starts the revolutions. It's never the proletariat, even though.
Yes, it's when the lawyers get radicalised, you need to worry rather than necessarily.
Yeah.
But so I think you must be really interested in listening to this as a politician. But just the last point before we finish up, we've got 4 minutes, I was at a speech by Gordon Matheson. I was debating him actually in the referendum. And he's just said cities and mayors are going to rule the world. I mean, that was his absolute perspective. It's almost if there was the return of the city-state almost, connecting up city-state by city-state, bypassing levels, almost with an ambition to bypass levels of government or treat with levels of government in a much more bullish way, in the way you were sort of suggesting.
They actually have more tools to work with than national government.
To do that through, But I'm interested. Because I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, I cited, the mid-2000s campaign for the Northern Assembly. Is there a possibility that just evaporates in the face of the energy of the open, empowered city? I mean, is there a kind of march of the cities moment that will render other levels of governance slightly moot, or is that would that be going too far?
I think it's possibly going too far, but it also depends how you define a city. And one of the things that is very different now to even 10 years ago is the pace of change within cities. And if you think about Manchester, like many other cities, has a much higher daytime population than it does a resident population, because people come into the city to work and feel ownership of the city, not because they're resident in the city, but because they're here every day. And how much right do they have to say is what goes on in the city, for example, because it's very important to them. They spend a lot of their time here. And I think there's much more of that. There's much more of a sense of identification with the city, even if you don't actually live there, because it's the place that you go to do things. And so how do you put all that together and hear those voices as well as the people who actually live here? But I do think that devolution is an idea whose time has come, and we do have to be careful that isn't just devolution to cities. In Scotland, for example, all the talk was about handing over power from one country to another country, and no discussion about how that then was distributed amongst the citizens. And I think, we've started with cities, but it's too big a revolutionary moment for it to be confined just to big cities, and really to make it work, there has to be that kind of ongoing revolution as part of the process.
But there's a sense of the city, not just as a laboratory for democracy, but as sort of an exemplar. There are things done here that can set precedents for maybe other wider governances, simply because there is a sort of coherence here. And you must find that's your goal, that's your prize, in terms of what you're doing in Mexico City.
Absolutely. I do believe the city travels at a different speed than the rest of the country, for example. But it's also interesting to see that there is a kickback as well. When we passed abortion rights in a very religious country, Mexico City
as Mexico City,
Mexico City, yes. Mexico City, I think, very much celebrated. We've always had, Mexico City government is only 17 years old, so we're not even adult age. There used to be a city regent appointed by the president. And since we have a city government, it has always been left-wing with a very progressive agenda. When we passed abortion laws, for example, other states are following suit, as well as gay marriage, and other ones are actually going 100 years back in history. So, for example, Guanajuato suddenly got a super outdated law, and now kissing is prohibited in public. So it's also very interesting to see that this effect...
Devolution.
Exactly. It can function as a mucin example, but it also helps for some cities to slip back.
Okay.
I mean, yes.
You have to balance somehow.
Yeah.
We're out of time, 30 seconds, if you want to make a point.
Well, no, yes, when you were talking, I was thinking to what extent, from my perspective, if in this era that has started with models like crowdfunding, I think that the concept of participatory budget and citizens and tools for letting citizens not only know where money goes, but having a say, this is a terrain that has to be explored in many ways as I think a good, and as a quite interesting, area to.
Well, listen, this has been a fabulous cosmopolitan download about the city. I've learned an awful lot, and I think being able to kind of have people from the bottom up, in the middle level, and at the top down to have a conversation about civic innovation has been a great idea. Well done, Drew. And could you please give a big cheer for the panel? Thank you very much.